This is The Red Line, where we interview three expert witnesses on one issue shaping the news both here and overseas. At the end of the Arabian Peninsula, bordering the deserts of Saudi Arabia and Oman, lies the home of the world's worst humanitarian crisis of our time. Yemen, a sparse, mountainous desert country, has been raging with civil war for the last 5 years. Hundreds of thousands have been killed in the fighting, and the country is tearing itself into increasingly smaller pieces. The vortex of war has dragged in countries from all over the world, including Bahrain, the UK, and the USA, just to name a few. But until this week, it seemed to be going nowhere. Just another Middle Eastern quagmire for the West to increasingly be dragged into. That was until this week, where tenuous peace talks were announced between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. But how did we arrive at this point? How did the war go for so long? Why was the West dragged in? And why is this civil war involving other countries? Well, for that, we turn to our first witness.
Part 1. A country built on quicksand.
The first time I walked out of the airport in Yemen was in 1973, and I walked out in a place called Aden, which had been the capital or the main place where the Brits had been involved, and at the time when I turned up there, it was the capital of what was the only socialist country in the Arab world.
Helen Lochner is a French writer, academic and researcher, mostly known for her work on the Middle East, with Yemen in particular. She's an author of many books, including Yemen in Crisis, which won the Grand Prix of Literary Associations in 2018. She is the foremost expert in Yemen, and she joins us today.
But Aden is very different from other cities and the rest of Yemen in the sense that it was a British colony. It wasn't even the British protectorate. So it had been until 1967 the capital, the Aden colony and a major staging post on the route to India. So it had been a very important place in the British colonial system.
So for people who might not know much about the country of Yemen, can you give a bit of a summary on the geography of the country?
Yeah. Well, the geography of Yemen is extremely varied, and I think that's an important thing to remember. And because of the variations in the geography, there's areas which have very high population densities, and that's really what you could call the backbone of the country, which is just east of the Red Sea coast, where you have these very high mountains that go up to 3,000 meters altitude. And so you have this mountainous area which grabs the monsoon and which have a lot more rainfall than anywhere else in the country, which is the area with the highest population density. And obviously, therefore, the area which had the most, it had rain-fed agriculture, it had, livable agriculture. And you have, major cities are basically Sana'a, Hodeidah, Taiz, Aden, and to a lesser extent, Mukalla. And that's it. You don't have other major cities. Other than that, you have, reasonably largish towns. Generally, you still have basically distances between towns that go back to the days of the desert frankincense route. So you have basically staging posts from the caravans. So you'll have some kind of market stroke staging post approximately every 30 to 50 kilometers from each other. Again, depending on, you don't do that in the desert. But it's also one thing that you do need to remember whenever looking at anything to do with Yemen, is to remember that it still has about 70% of its population rural. It still is a very largely rural economy and rural society. So the geography of the country, has a very strong determining impact on the way the population lives, and on both on population distribution and on economic activities that people have.
So the single unified country of Yemen as we know it hasn't existed for very long at all. In fact, before 1990, it was two separate countries. Can you explain why that is?
Yeah, well, basically, you had the border between what was in the past the Emirate and later on the Yemen Arab Republic, which was established in 1962 on the one hand, and on the other, Aden, the British colony of Aden and its protectorates, was established in about 1932 or 34, I can't remember exactly. Basically because the Emirate considered that all of Yemen was theirs, and the Brits really wanted to maintain, their border. But again, they had the basic border that existed until 1990 was established in the 30s between London, the British colonial power, and the Emirate, who had taken over control of the capital in Sana'a until, after the Ottomans left in 1918. So basically, you had these two states until 1990. And from 1978 onwards, the northern part, the Yemen Arab Republic, was ruled by Ali Abdullah Saleh. And in the south, you had the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, which was established after the departure of the British. You'd had about 4 years of civil war, of anti-colonial war, of liberation war between 63 and 67, at the end of which included also an internal battle between two major fronts that wanted to take over from Britain. And the one that got the power in the end was the National Liberation Front, which later on became the Yemeni Socialist Party, which was basically a Soviet-aligned regime which tried to introduce various forms, a form of socialism in the country. In the 80s, there were any number of problems within the regimes, both in the north and in the south. And after 1986, when there was another big conflict in the south, an internal sort of conflict within the Yemeni Socialist Party, the regime very much lost credibility. At the same time, things were becoming quite difficult in Sana'a because Ali Abdullah Saleh was becoming, more autocratic and not providing what people were expecting. And in basically having fought two wars between them in 1972 and 1979, by the late 80s, the two regimes were faced with the options of either fighting each other or getting together. And they decided to get together. And so in 1990, you had unification and the establishment of the Republic of Yemen.
So at this point, the two Yemens have merged into one country, but there's still huge fault lines between the two factions, particularly toward Saudi Arabia and the government in Riyadh. So what was the Saudi relationship like between the former Emirati-led government of North Yemen, based in Sana'a, and the former communist government based in Aden?
Okay, well, one thing you have to always remember when you're dealing with Yemen is that you will find a number of incredibly contradictory and weird situations. Let's start with Aden because that's the easy one. Aden had been the socialist, or you use the word communist country in Arabia. It was obviously detested by the Saudi regime. But now, because the Saudis weren't particularly keen on unity, they supported the separatist movement in 1994. And although they didn't recognize it diplomatically, they still, they encouraged the separatist movement. And those were the same leaders whom they had, been totally against 10 years earlier. So you can see a clear ambiguity there. The situation in Sana'a is, very different. The relationship between the Saudi regime and the regime in Sana'a has been ambiguous for a very long time. The Saudis have been concerned about Yemen, and in a sense, I find it difficult to really understand because I don't think it's rational, but they regard Yemen as a threat and have done for a long, long time. Basically for the last 30, 40, 50 years. So what the tactic that was used in the 90s, it was for the Saudi regime is, on the one hand, it financed the Yemen state that was after unification, or even before it, from the 80s and 90s. So it simultaneously financed the Yemeni states and financed the groups that were in a sense rival to the states. And in the north, this was basically the major the two big tribal confederations, or certain major tribal leaders. So that the idea was the usual divide and rule, prevent the state from being really strong by creating a sort of set of rival type of institutions. So it was a very ambiguous relationship. But Yemen has been dependent on, or the Yemeni regimes have been dependent on finance from Saudi Arabia, basically ever since the end of the 1960s to 70s civil war.
So you're suggesting this might be Saudi Arabia's chickens coming home to roost after spending so long and so much money trying to destabilize the country?
I mean, my summary of the Saudi position, which I think is shared by many, is that Saudi always wanted Yemen to be strong enough not to be a threat and weak enough not to be a threat. So in a sense, the current situation is not satisfactory from that point of view, because it's become too weak as a country.
So in 2011, a political asteroid hits the Middle East, beginning what would be known as the Arab Spring. Revolutions broke out all over the Middle East, and it toppled governments in Tunisia, Libya, and even ended the decades-long rule of Egyptian dictator Hosni Mubarak. I mean, it's pretty hard to convey how earth-shattering these events are for the Middle East. But how do they affect Yemen?
Yemen was very much at the heart of it. I mean, you'd had a significant rise in discontent from about 2000 onwards. In that decade, you'd had the rise of the Houthi movement, which had, from 2004 to 2010, had a series of 6 wars against the Saleh regime. You'd had the rise of the Southern separatist movement. I mean, the post-1994 to 2007, anger and frustration in the South continued for a whole host of reasons, which, again, we could spend a lot of time discussing. But the Southern separatist movement re-emerged strongly in 2007. You had a very widespread dissatisfaction throughout the country by most people, lack of jobs, lack of income, bad quality education, the main social and economic frustrations that you've had everywhere in the Arab world, and it's re-emerging again, now in different countries. Now, what happened in early 2011, and with what happened in Tunisia and Egypt, is that it basically gave an impulse for this movement to explode in a much bigger way than it had done before. I mean, I remember being in Sana'a when the day Mubarak fell. And, it was about 6 in the evening in Sana'a when we heard about it. And just suddenly, you could hear the whole city rising. I mean, it was just incredible, car horns, shouting, screaming. I mean, it just, there's a whole event going on and starting. And you'd already had, serious sit-ins going on and live-ins going on for quite a few weeks already at that time. So it was basically an explosion of frustration and the hope. I mean, I think what 2011 showed in Yemen and elsewhere, in Syria as well at that time, is hope that you could change the regime and get an improved situation. But basically what happened is that there was on the 18th of March, there was a massacre when the Saleh's forces basically killed a lot of people on the Friday demonstrations. They had every Friday, they had big marches and demonstrations after prayers, which were held on this main big road. And what happened also and that split the regime. So you had a whole section of the military and of the political parties that were associated with Saleh to some extent, basically joining the revolution. And that all affected the nature of the revolution in the street, but it also led to the international community, basically, Saudi Emirates, the UN, the Brits, the Americans, and everybody, thinking that we've got to get a transition. So they pushed for a transition deal and the introduction of a transitional regime. And you had then, during this transition period, which was also supposed to be assisted by the international community with very considerable, they pledged $8.7 billion of economic assistance and things of that kind, which should have contributed to improving living conditions and sorting out, social infrastructure as well as create jobs, and which basically never really materialized. It was supposed to solve a lot of things, and it was supposedly run or managed with UN support and other international support. And I think it's one of the elements where the UN, were really abysmally failed, because they should have done things very, very differently.
So unlike the political changes in Egypt and Tunisia, there isn't huge progress in Yemen. So all the tensions are there, and the government can't fix it, nor could the UN fix it. So no one's really happy at this point. But where does that lead?
Basically, the situation in the country continued to deteriorate. People had less and less services and were more and more frustrated. And so when the National Dialogue Conference collapsed, by that time, it didn't collapse, it ended formally. It didn't, correct that, because it definitely did not collapse. It just ended normally. But what had happened by then is that the Houthis had, here again, a contradiction to get used to, by that time were in alliance with Ali Abdullah Saleh,
who at this point is the deposed president of Yemen.
And they gradually took over in 2014. They took over different parts of the country, finally taking over Sana'a in October. And so that's basically, by that time, you had the elements for the war to start.
The Houthis, who we will talk about a bit later on, gave up on the peace talks, and using their forces and forces loyal to ex-President Saleh, declared war and started pushing southwards into the heart of Yemen in an attempt to gain control of the country. Can you elaborate a bit on that first big push by the Houthis that kicked off the Yemeni civil war we know today?
Well, what happened is that between 2011 and 2013, they gradually expanded their influence and taking over the areas very near their homeland. So if you look at the map, it's basically, all of their governorate of Saada and bits of the neighboring governorates. But what happened in 2014 is that they moved south very quickly, first to Amran and then to Sana'a. And there was some fighting, but very little fighting, because most of the military forces were still Saleh's forces, and by that time he was allied with the Houthis. So there was limited fighting, mainly in Amran in June, if I remember rightly, the month. But by the time they got to Sana'a in August, September, there was practically no resistance, because the Saleh people just sat in their encampments or at home or whatever and let the Houthis take over when they weren't actually working with them. It came to a point where basically the Houthis put an agreement under Hadi's nose, which was basically surrender.
With Hadi being Salah's ex-vice president and current president of the UN-recognized government in Yemen.
They're saying that they would, it was just a surrender document, and he had the two options, resign or sign, and at that time he took the best option, which is that he resigned, and his government resigned, and then they were put under house arrest. And then they escaped and set up their temporary capital in Aden, and then the Saudis moved in. They wrote a letter to the Saudis asking them to move in, to start supporting the legitimate regime.
Yemen, a country that had only recently been put together, is now tearing itself apart. The difference this time being that this war is now dragging in more and more of the international community. The Houthis now control the capital Sana'a, the port city of Hodeida on the Red Sea, and are trying to push further and further into the country. This hasn't given them the quick victory they hoped for, but it has given them what the UN terms as the worst humanitarian crisis of our time. it's hard for me to explain what it's like on the ground there. So instead, we turn to our next guest.
Part 2. Islands in the Desert.
My first impression, I had just come from Cairo, and I had lived in Cairo for 2 years after university. And Yemen was so much less developed than Cairo. I mean, it was just like night and day. And I was a bit shocked by how isolated Sana'a felt when I first got there. Like, it existed in its own little world. But very quickly, I was brought into the warmth of Yemenis, I would say. I mean, for a country that experiences so much conflict, there is a true warmth to the culture there.
Laura Kasinof is a freelance journalist who reports for the New York Times on Yemen and the Middle East. Laura's work has also appeared in The Economist and The Washington Monthly, as well as her own book, Don't Be Afraid of the Bullets. She joins us today.
Life in Sana'a, when I first lived there, you know, I took taxis, I went around by myself. It wasn't like a scary Yemen that I think would probably exist in most people's imagination.
What makes this conflict so difficult to cover is the fact that there are so many competing forces in the war, all with wildly different goals, to put it mildly. Can you give us a rundown on all the major players in this one?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many players in the war in Yemen, so it's hard to even pick. I mean, the main ones obviously are firstly the Houthis, the rebels who existed in northern Yemen. They sort of came out of the fall of the Imamates, and during the Arab Spring protests, the Houthis sort of used the power vacuum to expand their territory and take up more land. And particularly, they were fighting sort of the group in Yemen that was aligned with the Islamist party in Yemen, which is known as Islah. That Islamist party is also seen as being in line with the current president of Yemen, who is Abdul Rabbu Mansur Hadi. And when I say Islamist party, it's not like they're all super religious and like extremists or things like that. It really runs the gamut. So you have the Houthi rebels, and they've still control of the capital in northern Yemen to this day. You have the government of Hadi, who are aligned also with these, with the Islamists in Yemen. And then, oh my gosh, then you also obviously have Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who were engaged in the bombing campaign against the Houthis. Now they're sort of working in partnership with the Yemeni government. The UAE, up until now, though that might be changing, and Saudi Arabia certainly control a lot of South Yemen. The part that's technically under control of the government, of Hadi's government, is actually being controlled for the most part by those other Gulf nation states. Then, of course, in the south as well, you have groups that are the sort of fundamentalist extremist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Now, the UAE has made headway against those groups over the past few years. The groups used to control territory, and the UAE sort of worked with certain groups in Yemen to push those more extremist groups out, but they're still there. I mean, the other thing you have the Southern Separatists in Yemen. These are groups who want the reestablishment of South Yemen, which, you know, South and North Yemen combined to form the country that there is today after the fall of the Soviet Union, because South Yemen was a Marxist state that was sort of under the influence of the Soviet Union. So anyway, then you have Southern Separatists. And there's like lots of Southern Separatists. They were kind of supported by the UAE. Now they have just struck a deal with the Yemeni government, but they are quite strong in southern Yemen as well. And they're not really like extremists or anything like that. I mean, you know, some of them are sort of the vestiges of this old socialist Marxist, was actually a Marxist state. But it's quite complicated. You have lots of competing interests when it comes to Yemen, and that's all obviously why it's difficult for outside audiences to sort of get a handle on the conflict, because it's not just Saudi Arabia versus the Houthi rebels or anything like that. There's a lot. Basically, when Saleh stepped down, there were lots of conflicts bubbling up in the country when he was in power, and he barely kept a lid on them. But then, when he stepped down and Hadi became president in 2012, all of those conflicts totally bubbled up, and Hadi has been a very incompetent president, and that's part of the reason why.
And how is the USA involved in all of this?
The U.S. has been, you know, providing weapons, of course, to Saudi Arabia The U.S. supplies weapons to Saudi, but then they also had been, I'm not sure quite the extent to it now, but they had been providing intelligence to Saudi as well in its war against the Houthis. Though I do think that the U.S., particularly under Obama, was frustrated with Saudi, though, you don't stop. The problem is that U.S.-Saudi relationship is so strong, something like this isn't going to stop it. So we're never going to, it seems highly unlikely the U.S. is going to stop giving weapons to Saudi Arabia unless there's some sort of monumental change selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. And and from there, it just sort of, feeds this war and that sort of thing. I mean, there also are definitely people within the Trump administration who are severe, paranoid about Iran. So, to an extent that seems quite wacky. And I think that, so there's not really the impetus to force Saudi or try to pressure Saudi to stop its war and destruction against the Houthis because, there's a lot of people in the administration who are so paranoid about Iran. And of course, the Houthis are aligned with Iran. That doesn't mean that they are totally Iranian puppets by any means, but they certainly are aligned with Iran, which is, of course, why Saudi Arabia was, very alarmed when the Houthis gained control and took control of Sana'a, because they saw it as a direct threat from Iran on their southern coast.
So why is Saudi Arabia so involved in this? Why are they willing to lose so much blood and treasure over Yemen?
From the onset, it seemed like it was paranoia about, the Houthis and the Houthis being aligned with Iran and Iran sort of getting a foothold in Yemen's southern border or in Saudi's southern border. And now, of course, the Houthis are, launching attacks into Saudi Arabia. So for Saudi kind of to just step down and step back, I mean, they have a an entity to their south that's at war with them that is attacking them. So but for why, throughout all these years, if they just continue to do it, I mean, that it's kind of hard to see, because what we know is that it just seems impossible that the Saudis are going to win this war against the Houthis. It's this classic situation of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan when you had Mujahideen fighting. The Mujahideen, they knew it was their land, they knew the mountains, it's this sort of thing. It's like the U.S. and Iraq. You have this problem happen over and over again. The Houthis know northern Yemen. They have a lot of weapons. They have control of northern Yemen. They know the mountains. I mean, how aside from just bombing all of northern Yemen to complete dust, how is Saudi going to win? It seems impossible. Yet, why do they continue? Is it a pride issue? Is it that it's not actually that big of a deal for them to continue this war? I'm unsure. It does seem like, the Saudis are currently, they have some control in southern Yemen at the moment. And do they just want Yemen completely under their control and they're not going to stop until that happens?
So much of this war's fighting has been centered around the port city of Hodeidah on the west coast of Yemen, which is currently controlled by the Houthis. Why are the Saudis fighting so hard to take back control of this port?
Hodeidah is the Houthis' only port. So I would imagine that Hodeidah is quite important to the Houthis for that reason. And then, of course, for the Arab countries, gaining control of Hodeidah sort of corners the Houthis. They now have no access to a port. So it's very important, I imagine, for that reason as well.
So the Iranians are increasingly becoming more and more involved in the war, supplying materials and arms to the Houthis in their struggle. Why do you think Iran is getting involved in this one?
When I was in Yemen in 2012 and when Saleh had just stepped down and Hadi became president, Iran was trying to increase its influence in Yemen left and right. So they were trying to increase their influence in southern Yemen amongst the southern separatists. They had already this relationship with the Houthis, but they were also trying with some Yemeni activists and really pro-democracy activists and young activists. These activists were being flown to Tehran. They were being flown to Lebanon and being given media training by Hezbollah. And it was very, very interesting that this was happening. I mean, I spoke with people who were flown to Tehran. And people who seemed quite liberal, were not connected to the Houthis at all. But they started to sort of, these people then had a bit of an Iranian angle to the way that they looked at global politics. And that was quite interesting. It's like the soft power thing. You can think of it a bit in the way that, Russia with Russia Today, is trying, enticing, maybe well-intentioned progressive thinkers watch Russia Today and maybe start to think of the Ukraine conflict with a little bit of a Russian bent. There's a historical rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and what more way to threaten Saudi Arabia than have Iranian influence in northern Yemen, which is right on the Saudi border, and make Saudi very paranoid.
So out of the combatants, who has the momentum on their side at the moment?
From the outside, it seems like a bit of a stalemate, I would say. Maybe I wouldn't say that one is gaining ground and one is losing ground. Certainly in South Yemen, the southern separatists were very much gained ground in that they seized Aden. And then the negotiations began in Riyadh between the council that sort of rules the southern separatists and the Yemeni government. With regards to northern Yemen and the Houthis versus Saudi Arabia, that it just doesn't seem like the war, it doesn't seem like any side is going to come up ahead. I mean, the Houthis seem to be, in some ways, launching the attacks into Saudi, their alleged striking down of drones, like this sort of thing. And that way they seem to be getting stronger in a way. Sometimes you get reports of Saudi Arabia and the Arab coalition making progress in regards to sort of the front lines in Western Yemen. Sometimes the Houthis make progress. It seems like, it's one step forward, two steps back. I don't know. It doesn't seem like either side's going to come out ahead, which is really horribly sad for Yemen, because it just means the war is going to continue. Because if either side isn't the sides don't seem at this point, though obviously anything could change, they don't seem willing to sort of come to the negotiating table with regards to peace. So anytime that happens, just fighting breaks out again and the bombings start again. So, that is, it's the people who are suffering the most, obviously, are, the Yemeni people, particularly those living in the north under the area that's under Houthi control, or the ones who are at the front lines of the fighting, of course, as well, both in the west and also in Taz in central Yemen.
So the situation in Yemen is being called the worst humanitarian crisis of our time. How bad is it on the ground there?
The hunger crisis issue is not the right word to use. The hunger crisis in Yemen, which, at times seems to border on famine. It's some of the worst in the world. And also coupled with that, you have cholera outbreaks every once in a while. You have the fact that there's hardly functioning hospitals. You have a region of the country that has very little access to anything from the outside world. And that's also, people aren't getting paid because, a lot of people were paid by government salaries from before. And so obviously there was some international business in Yemen, but that's hardly happening now under the Houthis. So you have, people aren't getting their salaries. And when even there's food on the shelves in grocery stores, people can't afford to buy it. People can't afford the price of petrol to get to the hospital when they have someone sick. So you have just sort of these compounding issues of this place that's completely closed off, which also, of course, is why we were talking about Hudaydah in the west, why that's very important for the Houthis. You have this place that's completely closed off that has, grave medical issues, that has a hunger issue, hunger crisis, and that is, that's what creates the sort of humanitarian crisis that we hear about and see about on the news, and that is rightly so, one of the worst things that we see in the world today.
This conflict in Yemen is costing its combatant countries billions and billions of dollars, and hundreds of thousands of lives are being lost in a quagmire that just gets deeper and deeper. So why go through all this? Why is Yemen so important to Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the West? We speak to our next guest to find out.
Part 3, where water is thicker than oil.
The thing about Yemen, the first thing anyone should know about Yemen is it is quite possibly the most complicated country on the planet. it is so difficult to, in a concise way, explain the political, military, cultural, religious, etc. Dimensions of Yemen.
Thomas Small is one of the biggest experts when it comes to the Middle East, with a first-class degree in Arabic and Islamic studies. He wrote the book Path of Blood and also co-hosted the podcast series Conflicted alongside MI6 agent Eamon Dean. Not to mention the guy's also won various BAFTAs and RTS awards for his documentaries on the subject.
Well, Yemen right now has been in the grips of a full-blown civil war for about 5 years, actually 5 years this month. It's been something like a stalemate for a long time, largely because the geography of Yemen really works against any final military solution there. The humanitarian crisis as a result of this conflict is acute. It has spilled over into wider regional and even global geopolitical considerations or geopolitical objectives.
So in your opinion, politically between the two sides, what is the difference between, let's say, the Houthis and the government forces?
The Houthis are a rebel group based in the north of Yemen. They are religious fanatics, religious fundamentalists. They have organized themselves very similar to the way Hezbollah in Lebanon have organized themselves. And like Hezbollah, which is an Iranian proxy in Lebanon, the Houthis have been accused of being an Iranian proxy in Yemen. Iran is a very agile operator in its regional geopolitics, and direct evidence of Iranian logistical, financial, or military support to the Houthis is not thick on the ground. However, I would say most analysts know that there is a lot of truth in the allegation that, like Hezbollah, the Houthis are an Iranian proxy in Yemen.
And what about the government forces loyal to Hadi?
Even at the best of times, Yemen was not a centralized state, and its military apparatus was not like conventional militaries. It was largely organized along tribal lines. Yemen is an incredibly tribal society, and in addition to the standard military, throughout the country there were tribal militias that were on again, off again, allied to the central government. So Hadi, the president of Yemen, as recognized by the UN, has always been slightly on the back foot when it comes to the military. He has a lot of support largely in the south of the country, from which he comes, and which always existed in a very uncomfortable relationship with the north, with the capital, where most of the population live.
So something not talked about a lot is Al-Qaeda's presence in Yemen. You know, they actually at one point had a very large foothold in the country's east. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a bit.
Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is an offshoot of the larger Al-Qaeda movement. Yemen was a breeding ground for Islamic terrorism well before 9/11, in fact, from the early 90s onwards. People might remember that a year before 9/11, there was a bombing in the port of Aden on a United States military vessel, the USS Cole, which was the first kind of salvo in Al-Qaeda's attack against American interests. Yemen has always been, as I said before, sort of suitable for terrorism because of its mountainous terrain, because the central government did not have much control over the periphery. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula achieved something unique in 2014, 2015, when, as a result of the instability of the Arab Spring era, they were able to conquer large swathes of the arid southeastern part of Yemen. For the first time, an Al-Qaeda offshoot successfully conquered territory, a large enough territory to begin establishing there something like state structures. When they conquered the city of Al-Mukalla in the southeast and were able to enter into relationships with local tribal actors who swore them their allegiance, and in general, they conquered a large swathe of the southeast of the country. Their experience of building something like nascent state structures there would have eventually bear fruit when we saw ISIS take over large parts of Iraq and Syria and form a state there. But Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula did it first. An Islamic terror group that conquered territory and founded something like a state. Now, more recently, they have been heavily fought back by, obviously, American forces in cooperation with Saudi and particularly Emirati forces on the ground. So at the moment, Al-Qaeda in Yemen is sort of on the back foot, but they're still there.
With Saudi Arabia in the west funding the Hadi government and Iran funding the Houthi government, you could almost call it a bit of a Middle Eastern Cold War going on. Do you think that's a fair analogy?
It is often called that, yes. Although the truth is it's more or less a hot war as far as I can tell. Obviously, there are actual wars raging all around the region, and though Saudi Arabia has not launched any direct military attacks on Iran, a couple of months ago, as is widely known, Iran, either most likely directly or possibly through its proxies in southern Iraq, did launch an attack on the Abqaiq oil facility in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. So it's a war that is more hot than cold, I would say.
So what are the aims of Iran? Why are they being so antagonistic in this conflict?
Well, in order to answer that question, I'm afraid we'll have to return to the fateful year of 1979, when the Iranian Revolution overthrew the Shah there, and the Ayatollah Khomeini came to power. In the years that followed, Iran adopted a new constitution. It changed its name to the Islamic Republic of Iran. And in its constitution, it is pledged to spread the revolution. Now, people often underplay this part of the Iranian phenomenon, but it is absolutely true that the Iranian Revolution, well, the religious side of the Iranian Revolution, which ended up triumphing, are deadly serious in their religious aims, and indeed in their let's say their eschatological aims. Eschatology being a word meaning the theology of the end times, of the end of days, of the end of the world. And the Iranian Revolution subscribes to a particularly Shiite version of an Islamic end time scenario, which involves them conquering the holy places of Medina, Mecca, and Jerusalem in expectation of the return of a figure known as the Mahdi, who will fight the great Satan, in this case America, and usher in an era of global peace where the whole world is peacefully and justly ruled by the Muslim empire. They believe this. So what stands in their way is Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is the state that currently controls Mecca and Medina, and Israel, which is the state that controls Jerusalem. So the Iranian government's entire foreign policy has, for 4 decades, been oriented towards antagonism towards Israel and undermining, as much as it can, the Saudi state.
And what is the Saudi aim in all of this?
Well, initially and primarily, Saudi Arabia's interest in the war with the Houthis is to defend its borders. The Houthis, as a proxy, so-called, of Iran, also constantly claim in their own propaganda that they will be conquering Mecca and Medina. And most importantly, from the point of view of Saudi Arabia, when they allied with Ali Abdullah Saleh and the military that remained loyal to him and conquered Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, they were able to take into their possession Yemen's enormous arsenal of Scud missiles. This was the first time in history that a non-state actor had acquired Scud missiles. Scud missiles are serious. They have very long, 1,500 kilometer ranges, meaning that suddenly Mecca, Medina, Riyadh were laid open to attack. So Saudi Arabia's goal in this is essentially and initially defensive. The Houthis opposed them for religious reasons. They got a hold of extremely dangerous weaponry, and they pointed them at Saudi Arabia.
And with these newly acquired Scud missiles, what are the main targets? What are they going to be aiming at to hurt Saudi Arabia?
Well, that is a very fascinating question, and it's not one that is often raised. Obviously, civilian targets are a possibility. I mean, the Houthis have certainly fired rockets, not Scud missiles, but rockets into Saudi cities nearer the border, killing civilians. They have launched some Scud missiles, most of which have been intercepted by Saudi Arabia's sophisticated Patriot missile defense system. But the primary threat from the perspective of the Saudis is that the Houthis and their Scud missiles could target the chain of desalination plants that stretch up the west coast of Saudi Arabia. We have to go back a few decades to put this into context. Saudi Arabia has no rivers. If you look at a map of the Arabian Peninsula, you will notice that there is no blue on it. The Arabian Peninsula is unique. There is no water there, no rivers, no lakes. So Saudi Arabia, a country of nearly 30 million people, the size almost of Western Europe, is always facing an existential threat that it has no water. Or in the early decades of the kingdom, in the 70s and 80s, a chain of desalination plants were created on the east coast of Saudi Arabia, on the Persian Gulf. But following the Iranian Revolution and the rise to power of the Ayatollah Khomeini, which became very antagonistic to Saudi Arabia, the then King Fahd of Saudi Arabia realized that his desalination plants were open to attack. So he built a huge number of desalination plants up the west coast, far enough away from Iranian missiles, no longer to be a threat. Well, now that the Houthis have Scud missiles and they're allied to Iran, both coasts lay open to Iranian attack. And should the Iranians successfully knock out the kingdom's chain of desalination plants on both coasts, it's just a matter of days before the entire kingdom would collapse into total anarchy, because people lacking water, they go crazy, and there would be massive instability, and the government would be brought down, and that would be bad for not just the region, it would be bad for the whole world.
And this is not just about the land, this is also about the sea routes, particularly the choke points to the southwest and southeast of Saudi Arabia. Is that correct?
Yes. So the Strait of Hormuz famously is the entrance into the Persian Gulf, and Iran semi-controls the Strait of Hormuz along with the state of Oman. But since the revolution, they have always had that card to play. That they could shut down the Strait of Hormuz, they could limit traffic in and out of the Persian Gulf. That would be terrible for oil shipments. Now, the other side of the other corner of the Arabian Peninsula is a strait called the Bab al-Mandeb, which is the strait into the Red Sea. When the Houthis conquered Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, and then moved their forces south, they were able to conquer the Bab al-Mandeb, which they held for about 7 months before the Arab coalition liberated it. That was immensely threatening to the world order, because now Iran, a troublesome state actor, could control both the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab al-Mandeb, through which a huge amount of the world's shipping passes, especially oil, on its way to Europe, and so having control of both the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab al-Mandeb gave the Iranian state a sort of chokehold on the global economy, greatly increasing its leverage in the world. And this is something that the world community could not allow, which is why when the Arab coalition was formed and entered into the civil war on the side of the legitimate government, the UN Security Council authorized that participation in the civil war to protect Bab al-Mandeb and in general protect global shipping interests and the global economy.
If these straits were to be closed off, what would that do to, let's say, the price of oil?
Well, I can't tell you specifically what the price of oil, how that would, the consequences it would have on the price of oil, but I can tell you it would cause the price of oil to go up, and the entire global economy is still more or less pegged to the price of oil. Oil doesn't just power our automobiles, oil powers the entire global economy. But it's not just the price of oil, it's essentially also just a geopolitical game. Iran, should it control directly or indirectly both of those straits, it would simply become a more powerful actor. It would be able to extract greater concessions from the United States, from the EU, from the Saudi Arabia in general. It would increase its power exponentially.
And where does the United States sit in all of this?
The USA, from the very beginning, has supported Saudi Arabia and the Arab coalition's intervention on behalf of the legitimate Yemeni government. As I said before, the UN Security Council also has supported this effort. There have been criticisms along the way. Obviously, the extent to which the Arab coalition has contributed to the humanitarian crisis in Yemen has been criticized by America and other world leaders. In terms of military assistance, America and indeed Great Britain, both of them provide extremely vital logistics and intelligence information to the Arab coalition, based primarily in the air base in Khamis Mushaib in the south of Saudi Arabia, where British and American Air Force officers and other forms of expertise help the Arab coalition to coordinate its air attacks against Houthi targets in Yemen. Obviously, America and Great Britain as well have also sold a lot of advanced weaponry to Saudi Arabia. This has given rise to criticisms from human rights organizations and other such groups, saying that Western states should not be selling Saudi Arabia these weapons, because these weapons in many instances have ended up killing civilian targets or civilians in general, which is contrary to the dictates of international law, of course. So there has been some criticism there, but in general, the United States is a partner of Saudi Arabia in this effort.
Well, peace talks have just started in Jeddah between the STC, the Southern Transitional Council, and the Hadi government, the UN-recognized government of Yemen. Do you have high hopes for these talks, and do you think it might bring a peaceful conclusion to this war?
Yes, well, in fact, the peace talks recently ended with the signing of an agreement between the STC, which ultimately seeks independence for South Yemen, and the legitimate government of Abdrabbu Mansour Hadi, who is backed by the Saudis and the rest of the Arab coalition. For some time, there were major tensions between the STC and the Hadi government, which was preventing the coalition from prosecuting the war against the Houthis as efficiently as they would have wished. So the last thing the Saudis want is for there to be division on their own side. So in August, the STC actually took over the government in Aden and accused President Hadi of links to Islamists, and basically said they no longer wanted anything to do with him. And then the Saudis brokered these peace talks in Jeddah between Hadi and the STC, and it does seem that they have agreed, for the time being, really, to set the contentious issues aside, to agree to ignore the question of South Yemen independence for the time being, and to present once again a united front against the Houthis.
This doesn't really solve anything at all. It's an alliance between the two people who are fighting for the south, but the Houthis are the main combatants. So effectively, the major players are still there. It's two minor players teaming up.
This is a classic Yemeni fudge, it seems to me. It's sort of kicking the can down the road. Yemen has never been unified politically properly. Certainly the South, ever since it officially unified with the North in 1990, has not been particularly comfortable with its position in a united Yemen. Calls to separate, a movement to separate from the North has been going on for a long time. The best that the Hadi government and the Saudi coalition are able to do, really, is to suggest that when they finally sort out the problem with the Houthis, which may include the Houthis in some kind of power-sharing agreement in the end, the best they can promise is that in future there'll be some sort of federal solution for a united Yemen, which would give the southern provinces, or perhaps the south as a whole, much greater autonomy. Whether that will satisfy the STCs, whose ambition really is to become independent again, is anyone's guess. But in the short term, this is a win for the coalition. They can now present a united front again against the Houthis.
Yemen has become a no-win quagmire, with only a small ray of light at the end of a very long tunnel. Even if the players change, the geopolitics will stay the same. Iran will have a proxy control on two of the most important maritime choke points in the world, as well as be in a situation to launch a flurry of Scud missiles against Saudi Arabia's only water supply. Desalination plants take years to build, and if the Houthis have control, then they could all be destroyed in minutes, plunging the country into complete anarchy. Now when Saudi goes, the world economy goes. Even just one rocket attack against one oil facility sent the price of petrol here in Australia up 15 cents a litre overnight. Can we imagine what would happen if the whole country imploded through a lack of water once they blow through their 30-day reserve? But surely just continuing the fighting can't be good either, with hundreds of thousands dying from the bombs and the disease. The Saudis don't have the manpower to retake Sana'a, and the Houthis don't show signs of giving up. Even with these peace talks, there is still a whole bunch of problems like Qaeda, who owns Hodeidah, and the Houthis that aren't being addressed. Some people may have optimism on this one, but I don't share the same feeling. The situation may change, but the fundamentals remain the same, and the fundamentals aren't stacked in our favour. Thank you so much for listening to The Red Line. We couldn't do this show without your listenership. A huge thank you to all the guests who participated in this episode. You can check out Helen's amazing collection of books on Amazon. I highly recommend you check out Yemen in Crisis, as it is the gold standard on this subject. You can read Laura's work on her website or follow her on Twitter. Her handle is @Kasinof, so that's Kasinof. As for Thomas, I recommend you check him and his buttery voice out on the amazing Conflicted series all about the Middle East. If you like this show, you will love Conflicted. Very similar premise. It opened my eyes to a huge amount of research for the Middle East, and I can honestly say it is some of the best listening I've listened to all year. You can also follow him on Twitter @SmallTom with an H in the Tom. You can support us here at The Red Line through our Patreon, which is linked on our Facebook @The Red Line Pod, or follow us on Twitter under the same username. You can also follow myself on Twitter at @SpellingExpert with 1L. Liking and rating the episodes are a huge help for us here at the show, and it helps us get this to as many people as possible. But in any case, thank you so much for listening, and we'll be back next fortnight with another international episode. But for now, as they say in Yemen, Wadi Yakhsadiki.